I'm Terrence McNally, and we're going to continue our discussion of ending the era and the threat of nuclear weapons. My next guest will be Tad Daley, author of Apocalypse Never, Forging the Path to a Nuclear Weapon-Free World. And I'm going to read just one little bitty piece from towards the end of the book. Tad Daley writes, actually he quotes novelist Arundhati Roy. "If you are religious," said Arundhati Roy shortly after India conducted its nuclear weapons tests in 1998, "then remember that this bomb is man's challenge to God. It's worded quite simply, we have the power to destroy everything that you have created." Miss Roy is a wonderful writer, Daley writes, but one might suggest that on this point she has it precisely backwards, and that this bomb should be seen instead as God's challenge to man. Can our social imagination, our governing institutions, and our political courage catch up with our ever-accelerating scientific and technological prowess? Nowhere is that challenge presented more starkly. Nowhere are the stakes conceivably higher than the challenge of abolishing nuclear weapons and saving ourselves from nuclear apocalypse. Tad Daley is the Writing Fellow with International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the 1985 Nobel Peace Laureate organization. He spent several years as a member of the International Policy Department at RAND, where many of the nuclear theories of the Cold War era originally were forged. He served as a speechwriter and policy advisor to Congressman Dennis Kucinich, Congresswoman Diane Watson, and the late Senator Alan Cranston. He once ran for U.S. Congress himself to represent Mid-City L.A. The L.A. Weekly at that point said about his campaign, quote, "Tad Daley boasts the most impressive credentials and most thoughtful platform of all the 16 candidates in the race. His ideas are as sensible as they are unconventional." Tad Daley's written for the Los Angeles Times, USA Today, Christian Science Monitor, Tikkun, and quite frequently in the blogosphere at Huffington Post, Truthdig, Alternet, Truthout, and Common Dreams. Welcome, Tad Daley.
Terry, hi. It's really a delight to be here. I would like to share with your listeners, I'm so pleased that you picked that passage from Arundhati Roy and my commentary upon it, but I'm not surprised.
Can you tell a bit, briefly, about your path to the work you're doing today?
Terry, the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, the notion that we have to protect our national security by threatening massive nuclear retaliation upon some other state in order to deter them from taking aggressive action against us, carries within it the possibility of a global thermonuclear war that could bring about the extinction of the human race. You and I both have gray hair, and so we're old enough to remember the Cold War, and that was really the fear that we had, that some kind of confrontation between the Soviets and the Americans would descend into shots being fired, and that would inexorably escalate to nuclear missiles being fired, and literally could bring about the end of the human race. And it gets back to what we opened by talking about, Terry. Is that really the best idea that these incredibly talented creatures called Homo sapiens can come up with to maintain peace on Earth? Terry, I know that it's within the power of the human imagination to envision something better than that for maintaining peace on Earth.
And so you're saying that, as you go back over the years, has driven you to the different causes, to the people you've advised, to running for Congress, and finally to this book.
Indeed, very much so. Yeah. And again, I draw the distinction between looking at the immediate nuclear peril and trying to look at the long term.
Right. In other words, it's not about Iran. It's about the past, the future, and the big picture.
You know, what drives me to take a slightly different tack is our obligations to our ancestors. Think how many of our ancestors 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago toiled to build the pyramids and the scientific and technological progress and the civilization that we now temporarily inhabit. And the notion that we can't come up with any better idea to maintain peace among this group of 6.6 billion humans than this thing that, again, carries within it the possibility, however remote it might be at any particular moment, just simply must be beyond all moral toleration.
And there's a wonderful line in one of Daniel Quinn's books, and I usually speak about it when I'm talking about evolution, because he says any species which imagines itself to be the end of evolution probably will be.
Lovely.
But in this case, I think it's still any, that struts its prowess around, as if it's the top of the chain, very well could end the whole thing. I did want to ask you a couple of things about your past. What was it like to work at RAND? Because RAND has this secretive, forbidding sort of reputation. What were you doing there, and what was it like to be there?
Well, sometimes we could hear the down in the basement the screams of the agents who were captured in operations and being, no, I'm kidding, that's not really the case. It's I think Rand has a bit of a bad rap, to tell you the truth. I am not unhappy with my time at Rand. A lot of people think of Rand as a real conservative outfit, like the Heritage Foundation or something, and it's not really the case. Rand really prides itself on dispassionate analysis. For me, I was a bit of an outlier at Rand, but it wasn't because of the left-wing, right-wing thing. It was more the distinction between analysis and advocacy, the distinction between description and prediction, which is what Rand really excels at, trying to look at some kind of contemporary policy issue very dispassionately and objectively and say, here's what's going on and here's what we think are the most likely scenarios to unfold. And I think there's a great value to that kind of work, and I'm certainly not opposed to it in any way, but I myself, since you're probing me, Terry, and my own personal inclinations, have just always been more inclined to, again, prescription rather than prediction. Not so much saying how what the world is likely to be 50 or 500 years from now, but what kind of world would we like it to be? Let's envision the world we would like to create, and then hopefully envision pathways by which we might get from here to there.
Yeah, very good. You've been working on these issues, the ones around nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferation, and so on, for many years, and yet this is your first book.
It is indeed, yes.
How did that happen?
Well, thanks for asking, Terry. It took about 5 years, and it's largely the project that I commenced walking down the path toward after I stopped working for Dennis Kucinich. I was the chief policy wonk of the Kucinich presidential campaign.
In which? In
the first one, 2003 and 2004.
Okay.
And was having to deal with all kinds of issues in which I was not terribly expert, like health care and Social Security financing and things like that. And I got to know Dennis very well, and I'm pleased to say he gave me some wonderful advanced praise.
The blurbs in this are great, yes.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, I tried to float it by a lot of people and get them to say not only that it's an important topic, but hopefully this is a book that illuminates not just the peril, but a pathway towards eliminating.
Let me say just one other thing, which I often want to point out about a book when it's the case. Hearing the title, you might think this is a terribly weighty and long and difficult tome, but before you get to the glossary and the notes and so on, it's basically 240?
240 pages? Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So this is not the 500-page thing that will sit next to your bed for weeks. This is it's readable.
Well, thanks, Terry, because the readability is really the answer to the question of how'd you go down this path of writing this book, Terry. I'm a nuclear policy wonk, and I've read damn near everything that anybody has churned out about that. Rand, as it happens, has been one of the major centers of thinking about doctrines about nuclear weapons and nuclear warfare and nuclear deterrence. And there's a lot of stuff out there that's very important and very detailed and very rigorous, but just not terribly accessible. And I'll give you a real answer to that question.
Let me just add, I think where you're getting to is why after all these years do you decide, as hard as it may be, I got to put this in a book, and I think you're getting to that answer.
Indeed, and it's not just put it in a book, but put it in a book that can be available to the general public, accessible and engaging, and I hope even uplifting and inspiring. And why, Terry? I will say this very, very directly. Books often, throughout American history, have served as catalysts of social movements. I think of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. I think of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. I think of the Feminine Mystique, is that the title?
Exactly.
By Betty Friedan?
Yep.
And indeed, I think of The Fate of the Earth by Jonathan Schell in 1982, which had a huge impact on inciting and igniting the nuclear freeze movement of the early 1980s. And now those of us in the, I admit, relatively obscure these days, nuclear disarmament movement, are trying to build a movement that is not just to freeze an ever-ascending arms race, but indeed a movement that's about dismantling every last nuclear weapon on Earth. And Terry, I will share with you candidly that I aspire for my book to play the same role in this movement 28 years later as Jonathan Schell's book, The Fate of the Earth, did for igniting the nuclear freeze movement.
Let me ask you one other question. As someone who had dealt in issues for a long, long time and finally had to focus them, channel them, make them accessible in one thing, any advice you would give? Because I'm assuming that there are a lot of folks who are either experts or activists or advocates any advice of what was the biggest challenge or the biggest lesson in actually putting it into one book and saying, this is my statement?
You ask not surprisingly provocative questions, Terry, as I know from listening to you, as I say, sometimes from 3,000 miles away. I would say that the most important thing, the most important angle of attack, perhaps I might put it, is to really decide to focus, is to really decide to pick an objective and a goal and a destination. And for me, I said I want to make the case for the abolition of nuclear weapons and really try to envision plausible futures by which that might come about. I'm here in Los Angeles and doing a number of book talks. The book has been out for only 7 weeks now. And just on Sunday night, I was at an event, and it was really wonderful, and the audience really engaged. But this woman's kind of grabbed me almost metaphorically by the lapels in the Q&A, and she said, well, why aren't you talking about abolishing nuclear energy as well? And why aren't you talking about depleted uranium as well? That's a nuclear weapon, isn't it? And that's leading to all kinds of birth defects in Iraq. And she's right about all those things, but among other things, I didn't want the book to be 477 pages. And I think that is my advice, is that you can't do everything. None of us can do everything. Thomas Aquinas was probably the last human being on planet Earth who was able to tackle the entire sum and substance of human knowledge and human challenge.
Right. Some people say Thomas Jefferson.
Fair enough.
But no, it's true. It's just impossible these days. Now, as I warned you at the start, Tad Daley, if you're willing, let's try my It's Broke, Let's Fix It format for the last 15 minutes of this show. And if we both agree that nuclear weapons policy is broken, I just want you to answer 3 questions. How is it broken? What's the evidence? How did it get broken? What are the causes? And how do we fix it? What are the solutions, and what can listeners do? So, first,
Terry, I think the main thing that is broken is what some call the nuclear double standard, what some call our own nuclear narcissism, what I call, in Chapter 2 of my book, the essence of the problem, America's nuclear hypocrisy. My book is not about Barack Obama and his nuclear weapons policies, but it is the case that Obama has forthrightly talked about abolition as a destination and as a goal and as the objective of American nuclear weapons policies. And I am delighted about that.
Yeah.
But when he gave that speech, when he first articulated that vision in Prague in April of 2009, he followed it up about 5 seconds later by saying, it may not happen quickly, perhaps not in my lifetime. And then a year later, in April of 2010, just a couple months ago, Terry, the administration issued something called the Nuclear Posture Review, which said for many decades to come, America still will need to rely upon nuclear weapons for this and that kind of scenario, and really articulated very explicitly to the world that even though we have this overwhelmingly powerful and superior conventional military, we still need to rely on nuclear weapons for our own national security. And, Terry, that's what's broken most fundamentally. How do you make the case to other countries, tiny countries like Iran and North Korea? And believe me, I think those countries are volatile and dangerous and unpredictable. But to say to them, you have a conventional military power, who knows, 1/1000th the size of ours, but we expect you to protect your own national security without resort to nuclear weapons, even though we cannot. It is utterly lacking in credibility.
And then if you add that Iraq, which we claimed was pursuing a policy, remember we don't want the smoking gun to be a nuclear cloud. They were attacked, and what is the lesson of when you think someone might be pursuing one that you preemptively attack? The lesson to a North Korea or an Iran is you don't want to be the next Iraq.
Boy, Terry, the leaders of Iran and North Korea are both volatile and dangerous and unpredictable. And the rhetoric that Ahmadinejad has engaged in is reprehensible. I think all of us ought to condemn it. But even irrational leaders can lead states that have rational national interests. And both of those countries can legitimately say, especially during the Bush administration, but I think still some of the dynamic exists, that this overwhelmingly powerful country, the United States, clearly can threaten our national interests, and the only possible way we can defend ourselves from the doctrine of preemption, from identifying the three of us as members of an axis of evil, is to acquire something like a nuclear deterrent, especially since we say that we need it. And, Terry, there's I unearthed this quote in my book that made it into my book from a North Korean general, January of 2003, just 2 months before we invaded Iraq. And Don Oberdorfer of the Washington Post somehow got to him and said, "What's with this nuclear program that you guys are apparently pursuing?" And with unbelievable candor, the North Korean general said, "We see what you are getting ready to do to Iraq, and you're not going to do it to us."
Wow. That's the voice of Tad Daley. He's the author of Apocalypse Never, Forging the Path to a Nuclear Weapon-Free World. I'm Terrence McNally. You point out, by the way, that I just want to add that in that April 6th announcement of our nuclear posture review, Secretary Defense Gates, you say, violated the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty on C-SPAN 3 separate times because he did what?
Well, that's a relatively obscure aspect of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There are several elements to what I call in my Chapter 6 the grand bargain of the NPT. The biggest one, the most fundamental one, is that the non-nuclear weapon states promise they will never acquire nuclear weapons, and the nuclear weapon states promise that they will get rid of theirs. Terry, I bet very few KPFK listeners even know that, let alone the broader public. Our country committed to eliminate its entire nuclear arsenal.
And that was in 1968.
You got it.
Yeah.
42 long years ago.
And we've signed 2 or 3 treaties since then. We've eliminated a few thousand weapons, but we still stand ready.
Indeed, indeed. But there are other elements to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and especially in the understandings of it that have been articulated in the review conferences that come every 5 years. And one is that we have pledged, the non-nuclear weapon states requested that we simply promise never to attack them with nuclear weapons. And to answer your question now directly, in this nuclear posture review issued in April of 2009, Gates essentially invented a new principle that said we're not going to attack countries with nuclear weapons that are in compliance with the NPT. And however reasonable that might appear on its face, it's just simply making up a new principle of international law out of whole cloth. It doesn't say what kinds of violations. It doesn't say who's going to decide. And I don't want our country being judge and jury and executioner of who's complying and who's not complying, especially since, again, we're not in compliance.
That's what I was going to say. We in Russia are not complying
with the most fundamental obligation of the treaty, which is to get busy moving toward a nuclear weapon-free world.
Yeah. And now, so that's the... How do we know it's broken? We know it's broken because this, and you're looking at it from our perspective, the perspective of the largest possessor, the one who has used them, and the one who we as citizens have some say about. How did it get broken? How did we get where we are today? Both, and I would think I'm asking you both commission and omission.
Well, excellent commission and omission. I don't think you really want to recount the whole history of the nuclear arms race, but between 1945 and the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union and the United States both felt threatened by each other, and when the one would build up its nuclear arsenal or engage in any kind of belligerent international behavior, the other felt threatened by it. And the only idea they could come up with was this ever-ascending spiral of nuclear arms, so that we ended up with something like, I think it is it 65,000 or 75,000 was the total?
At the peak between the two of us, or just us?
Yeah, no, the global total.
Yeah.
Yeah, either 65 or 75.
Now, as you point out, the Soviet Union collapsed in 89, right? Or 90? In any case.
December 31st, 91 is when it formally went out of business. The Berlin Wall falls in 1989. It's fair to say the Cold War has been over for more than 20 years.
Right.
And in fact, Terry, that is really the sin of omission.
Omission.
And I don't really write a whole lot about this in my book, but maybe I should have, because I will confess that I'm a Democrat. Worked for Dennis Kucinich. I guess that makes sense.
The Democratic wing of the Democratic Party?
Exactly, yes. And I voted for Bill Clinton twice. And yet, on this issue, I think Bill Clinton missed an enormous historical opportunity. He took office just a year or two after the Cold War comes to an end. If there was ever a moment in history to say, we have lived, as I talked about.
And he came in on a change election.
Exactly. And as we talked about at the outset, could have said then, we have lived with this threat, literally, of annihilating ourselves, of bringing about our own extinction by our own hands because of this confrontation called the Cold War, which has dominated world politics for nearly half a century, and now it is over. So by God, let's come up with some structures of international peace and security that can be invented and maintained without carrying within it the seeds of that possibility. And let's ratchet down the nuclear arms race and move towards abolition. And Bill Clinton essentially did nothing.
In some sense, he took a step back from Reagan, who in his last couple of years was moving surprisingly in changing America's nuclear posture at the very least.
Indeed he was, and that, I think, is largely, this is not the question you asked, but I think that is largely in reaction to the nuclear freeze movement of the first half of the 1980s, which dramatically affected the Reagan administration policies of the second half of the 1980s.
And also
we made him do that.
One of those issues on which Reagan showed he was willing to change without losing the feeling that Americans had that he was a man of conviction. So, this whole thing of that you can't change and you can't change U.S. policy is just not true. I'm speaking with Tad Daley. I'm Terrence McNally. Okay, so we've asked, how do we know it's broken? How did it get broken? Okay, how do we fix it? What you set out in this book to say it can be done. How can it be done?
Well, first, this isn't quite the question you asked, but I do want to say that Obama has done a lot of good things. Not only that, the speech in Prague, where he, again, set out the destination, but then said it's a very, very long-term destination. And here's a tangent on the tangent. Apparently, Terry, Hillary Clinton, our Secretary of State, just a week or so ago, spoke about the ultimate destination of abolition and referred to it happening, quote, in some century.
Oh, golly.
Not even in the next century, in some century. So that is a time frame well beyond the lifetime of the current president, isn't it? And that is what I think we have to challenge. I'm delighted that Obama's talked about abolition. I'm delighted the START treaty is relatively modest and relatively timid and doesn't reduce the ultimate capability of essentially destroying the world at all. But it is still, of course, a step in the right direction, and I'm certainly for, as are the Countdown to Zero people, for ratifying the START treaty. Obama has done wonderful things regarding nuclear terror. I have nothing but praise to offer about Obama's really taking seriously the challenge of trying to secure. Until we can eliminate nuclear weapons, we need to secure all nuclear weapons.
And that had been lagging in the years under Bush.
It sure had. So on a lot of those kinds of short-term immediate things, Obama is doing a very good job. But those of us who both worry about the immediacy of the nuclear peril and worry about the long-term challenge of saving ourselves from ourselves think that we simply need to move in the direction of abolition in a much more timely manner. How? It's actually stipulated in the NPT, and again in these understandings that have emerged.
The NPT,
the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that when we were talking about not only did we make the promise in 1968,
but we actually laid out a roadmap.
Partially in the treaty and partially in the review conferences of 1995, 2000, and most recently just a couple months ago in 2010. What we in the disarmament advocacy community are calling for is activating Article 6 of the NPT by launching formal, multilateral, international negotiations directed at envisioning and ultimately designing and implementing what we call a nuclear weapons convention that would be universal, that would be verifiable, that would be enforceable, and that would really create the architecture of a nuclear weapon-free world. And Barack Obama, for all the good things he's done, hasn't said a word about what a nuclear weapon-free world might actually look like. I'm pleased to say that I do think my book makes something of a contribution. The longest chapter in the book is called The Architecture of a Nuclear Weapon-Free World, and I at least try in there to tackle the questions that we'll have to address. What kind of verification measures will we have to invent? What kind of enforcement? What will we do about the UN Security Council veto, given that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council today happen to be 5 nuclear weapon states? So I want the administration and the broader foreign policy establishment to really begin thinking about how we might get from here to there and what a post-abolition world might actually look like.
Very good. And I want to point out we don't have time to talk about it, but the 4 states that lie outside, the 4 nuclear-possessing states that lie outside, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, would have to be dealt with in that movement forward.
By all means, yeah, that's certainly the idea, is that all 9 nuclear-armed nations would come together to say, we think that whatever benefits these things might ultimately provide to our individual national security are far outweighed by the costs to common human security of living in a world forever awash in nuclear weapons.
Okay, final quick question. Besides reading Apocalypse Never and seeing Countdown to Zero, organizations, actions listeners should take. Give you 1 minute.
Well, I'll plug the website apocalypsenever.org, which has both a lot of information on the book and the topic and on some of these organizations. I guess Countdown to Zero has a website called simply Take Part. Did you cite that, Terry? I think it's called takepart.com/0. And there's organizations that have been working on this for years. I will cite a couple. One is Peace Action. Peace Action is America's largest grassroots peace advocacy organization. They work on issues like Iraq and Afghanistan, but also on moving toward a nuclear weapon-free world. You mentioned I'm a fellow with International Physicians Preventing Nuclear War, and we have a thing called ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN.org.
And one other organization that I'm aware of, I've had Joe Cirencioni on the show a couple of times, is the Plowshares Fund.
Indeed, and Plowshares is actually a funder. Plowshares is really trying to find the places where we can really fund civil society efforts that will really leverage the movement and indeed build the movement to the same kind of force and impact and power that, again, it had in the early 1980s.
Okay, I've been speaking with Tad Daley, author of Apocalypse Never, Forging the Path to a Nuclear-Free World. You can learn more at apocalypsenever.org. O-R-G. Tad Daley, keep up the good work.
Terry, I've been delighted to be on with one of the most important interviewers in America.
Thank you. I blush.